Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to join our presentation today from English Australia and Bonard. And today we're really excited to be releasing the 2019 Annual ELICOS survey results. Normally we would be out running these sessions in each state. Obviously, due to the circumstances this year, we're unable to do that, but we are hoping through today's session and other consultations, we'll be able to at least give you as much of the data as we've done previously. Firstly, a big thank you to every college that participated in the survey once again this year. It's your support in contributing to the survey and providing your data, which really gives validity to the results. So, you know, a special thanks to everyone that participated. On the line, and you can probably see my colleague, Patrick Pavlovich, who is our head of research in Bonard. Patrick and the team at Bonard have been wonderful supporters of this research project for the past 3 years now, and have really supported English Australia in the way in which we've aimed to evolve the survey, aimed to bring the survey some new analysis to it, and other aspects of data collection, which has really added to the quality of the report. All of you that have worked with the team capturing the data, I know you will find them very good to work with as well. So special thanks and welcome to my colleague Patrick. I'd also like to really thank Allianz Global Assistance. Allianz, as many of you who have attended the sessions over the years would know, they've been our primary sponsor for the work in this market intelligence and data collection process. I do want to thank them and really note their ongoing support. And it's one that's been enduring throughout the time. So I'll give a little bit more comments on Allianz before we end today. Today's presentation, and with the interest of time, we're going to have to run through things relatively quick. We know that all your time is precious, and obviously we wanted to try and keep the presentation to an hour today. Equally, there's a lot of content that we are presenting, and we hope to be able to draw out some of the insights from the report to really assist you in your own analysis. This year, we will be sending out the report to all our participating institutions electronically. So tomorrow you will receive the report in your inbox. Historically, we printed the report and handed them out at the presentation and sessions, but with the constraints of distance and virtual meetings at the moment, hopefully having that soft copy report will also provide assistance to you.
Let's go into the data itself and let's talk about how Australia performed in 2019. So we can get one more. Thank you very much. Basically, 2019 was a mixed development year for Australia. You can see the development is the historical trends in both student numbers and student weeks. In terms of year-on-year development, student weeks remained fairly flat. We've noted a 1 percentage point decrease. In terms of student numbers, the situation was a bit worse due to the decreases in mostly visitor visa holders. Student numbers dropped by 5% year-on-year. I'm going to also talk about how this compares to the global situation in 2019, so that you have a bit of a wider context. Although we don't have a full picture as of yet, it can be noted that in terms of weeks, Australia performed relatively well, as in other destinations we are going to mostly see decreases in student weeks. However, in terms of student numbers, other destinations seem to have performed better than Australia. If we can move to the next slide, please. Sophia, are you able to get me through? Thank you. So this is the development in the number of student visa holders. This is the longitudinal trend data. As you could see, the number of student visa holders peaked in 2018. There were 2 consecutive years of decline, and last year the number of student visa holders actually dropped by 1.5 percentage point. If we look at non-student visa holders, which is a significant cohort of ELICOS students in Australia, they represent 30% of all enrollments in Australia. The figures dropped by 13%. This is a cumulative figure for the visitor visa, working holiday, as well as other visa types. And this is the data coming from the national survey when we look at student visa holders. Next one. I'm going to briefly talk about Australia's global position in the market. So one of the advancements that we aim to bring to the national survey is to be also able to provide how Australia performs in the global context. And at Bonnard, we collaborate with 8 major ELT destinations, which would be the US, Canada, the UK, Ireland, Malta, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. And by being able to put all of these data points together, we were able to create a global benchmark for the industry. So if you look at the macro overview, in 2018, which is still the latest statistically closed year, we had some 1.38 million English language students. The figure counts all students, so both pathway students, summer school students, group enrollments, and so forth. So this is really the total number of students. And within this context, Australia was the 3rd most preferred destination globally after the UK and the US. In terms of student weeks, the US is still the market leader thanks to the strong intensive English program segment, but Australia is neck to neck with the UK, and actually in 2019 it outperformed the UK to become the 2nd most popular destination in terms of student weeks. This is also due to the fact that Australia exhibits quite a long average length of stay compared to the UK, which also caters to a significant proportion of junior students. So in the UK, you have more than 50% of students are juniors who spend considerable low time in the UK, whereas in Australia, 90% of all students are adult students. That also translated into the positive ranking in terms of average length of stay, where once again, the US leads thanks to the strong pathway sector, and Australia follows on the 2nd place. Moving on. We can look at the student profile in Australia. This is the comparison of student visa and non-student visas. The most important takeaway is that currently student visa holders comprise 70% of all ELICOS students in Australia, and the remainder is distributed or represented by students coming to Australia on visitor visa, working holiday visa, and other types of visa. And this is the sort of mixed development, whereas student visa holders faced a decline of 1.5 percentage point, then non-student visa holders declined by 13 percentage points. Now we can also look at historical development in terms of year-on-year changes. First in student numbers. You can go to the next. Thank you. As you can see, after a rebound in 2013, the sector has continued to grow, although the growth has been slowing down. So we have seen a flattening curve, flattening development in Australia up until 2019, where student numbers dropped by 5 percentage points. In terms of student weeks, which is the next slide, we saw a much more volatile, much more flexible development. So if you could see 2013 really strong rebound when the sector expanded by 1/4. We saw slowly and gradually decline in terms of student weeks spent in Australia. And while in 2018 the industry was already flat, 19 posted the first decline since 2011. Going to the next slide. This is a more detailed overview of how important other visa sectors are for the Australian ELICOS sector. The development in terms of year-to-year meant that student visa, thanks to dropping at a lower pace, increased their market share to the previously mentioned 70% market share. We saw working holiday visa and other visas being rather flat year on year, while on the other hand, visitor visa posted the most significant drop of all non-student visa. Moving on, let me also briefly comment on the average length of stay, as it fairly differs by the student and non-student segments. For the Australian average in 2019, students spent on average 13.6 weeks in Australia, which was a considerable improvement compared to 2018, when students took courses with an average length of 13 weeks. So despite the fact that Australia welcomed fewer students, students stayed longer in Australia, which resulted in a less steep decline in student weeks. Student visa holder remains the category with the highest average length of stay, on average 16.6 weeks, and it's followed by other visa holders who on average spend 12.1. Visitor visa 5.1 weeks, a slight decrease compared to the previous year. We can also move next. The regional component is very strong in the ELICOS Market Report, as you are aware. Asia Pacific remained the most significant source region of ELICOS students. Nonetheless, the year-on-year development points to a considerable decline. As you can see, it's 9% in terms of students and 5% in terms of student weeks. The development was mostly driven by declines in the major markets such as China, Japan, but also Taiwan. On the other hand, positive development was recorded in case of India and Thailand. In terms of other regions, Americas sort of reinforced their position and increased their market share year on year, mostly driven by an influx of new students from Colombia. The region posted a 6% increase compared to 2018. Even more importantly, the increase in student weeks, which was recorded at 12%, so a double-digit increase year on year, has also translated into a positive economic impact, which I will be talking about shortly. Meanwhile, Middle East and Africa continued to decline. This is pretty much in line with the global market trends, where we see student numbers and student weeks from the Middle East decreasing gradually. And the market actually decreased its global market share. So 5 years ago, it accounted for 22% of all student weeks generated. Nowadays, it's only 11%. So effectively, the market shrunk by 50%. Europe is a smaller region for Australia compared to Latin America and Asia Pacific. Nonetheless, there was a minor increase, predominantly driven by students from Spain and Germany. Moving next. The report also specifies the average length of stay and by region and visa type. As you can see, Americas, the students from the region spend on average 19.2 student weeks, which is one of the longest of all student cohorts in Australia. It also had the higher average for working holidaymakers as well as visitors. So visitors were 5.1 on average, but for the Americas, students spend on average 5.9. In terms of Asia Pacific, student spend 15.5 weeks on average. This relates to the student visa holders again. When it comes to visitors, due to the relatively lower average length of stay, mostly by Japanese students, the average length of stay is a bit lower, 4.7. We also have data on Europe and other regions, but perhaps for the in order to make timely progress, I would skip these, as it is also possible to find in the report. Yep, what is really of importance is to look at the economic impact of each region. The biggest decline in terms of monetary value brought to the Australian economy, and I just want to make a quick note that this is direct economic impact, so student spending, tuition, accommodation, as well as living cost. The Americas dropped, but thanks, actually, so apologies, the Americas was the only region to showcase growth. Actually, it was 18% year-over-year, which is a massive boost compared to the other regions, especially Asia Pacific being the biggest source region for students, having a 3 percentage point decline in terms of economic output. Moving next. Key source countries for Australia in 2019. There were no change in terms of the top 10 ranking itself. However, there were changes in terms of specific order of countries. China accounts or represents the biggest country for Australia. But if you look at the market performance year on year, we can see that the market dropped by 15% in terms of student weeks. The top 3 countries, which are comprised of China, Japan, and Brazil, they all declined, equaling to an aggregate decline of 15 percentage points. If you look at the rest of the top 10 ranking, we could see that thanks to increases, as I said, from India, Spain, but also Thailand, the overall drop is a bit lower. And accounted for 8 percentage points year on year. So we can see essentially the key takeaway, which is embodied in the fact that the biggest source countries for Australia posted rather negative development year on year. To a certain extent, these were offset by performance of Colombia, which was the star performer in 2019, mostly for standalone and vet colleges, and it was followed by India, Thailand, and Spain, if we look at top 10 markets specifically. Looking at further stats on the next slide, this basically depicts the importance of other than student visa holders for Australia, for particular countries. You can see that, for instance, Colombia is a market that is largely determined by student visa holders. In fact, some 94% of all students from Colombia are on student visas. Whereas if you look at some of the Asian markets, such as Japan, it's clear that student visa holders do not represent the majority of students, and students use other visa routes to enter Australia to learn English, predominantly visitor. When it comes to Japan, similar case in South Korea, where the visitor visa and working holiday represents the majority of students. Other than that, we could also see a significant proportion of non-student visa holders in Taiwan and also Thailand. We can also have a quick look at how things change when we talk about student weeks. So naturally, due to the longer stays, the ranking shifts. Colombia and Brazil both overtake Japan as the second and third biggest market. And you can clearly see the dominance of student weeks, which refer to students on student visa, as they spend the longest in Australia. A brief look at the performance of top countries in terms of top growers and top declining markets. As I said, Colombia posting really big double-digit increases, both in terms of student numbers and student weeks. So it was 20% in numbers, 24% in terms of student weeks. We also saw a positive development by Nepal and India, as well as France and Germany, representing European markets, which are rather small in numbers, in volume, but offered really good growth opportunities in the course of last year. And then in terms of largest decreases, this refers to what I mentioned, and perhaps underlines the need to have a closer look at diversification strategies. We saw China and Japan as the top two markets posting double-digit declines as well. So in terms of student numbers, 15 and 19 percentage point respectively. South Korea, this is largely in line with the global developments, thanks to building domestic infrastructure. The market has been declining for 6 years now globally. Brazil, which is now the second largest market globally, posted a negative development, so 7 percentage point decrease. And also Malaysia, who's also an important source country for Australia in terms of student weeks. I believe it's the top 10 market now. I think that we have Brett now.
Hi, Patrick, and thank you, everyone. Apologies for the technical issues there experienced, but wonderful job, Patrick. I've actually just enjoyed listening to your analysis there for a while, Patrick. So I'll chime back in for a little and then hand back over where we can. So we'll have a look at the state analysis. One of the things Patrick's been, I think, noting throughout the presentation has been the decline in this past period that we saw and the impact of Asia Pacific. Some really valid points around the emerging markets out of the America, and indeed, had we hit those maturity levels with China, Japan, China, Japan, South Korea. But I think it's also useful to note just the significant reliance we have. Asia Pacific, which we can see across each state, it's still the most dominant region in terms of student flows. I guess that does pose that risk factor, which we saw in this last year period. And we also saw in some of those markets, particularly in those top 10 source countries, such as China, the impact of shortening the durations of those stays. So it's kind of a double impact on the economic performance of a state. You have the declining numbers coupled with the reduction in student weeks from particularly those major source markets. We'll cover the states in a little bit more detail. I'll just move on. I guess the only thing to note, last year we had a little bit of a change in the order. We had Queensland overtake Victoria last year in terms of its total student numbers. Queensland in particular has been the state that had the most reliance on non-student visas, and we've seen that shift over the past few years. But the impact in this last survey period was a decline in the order of about 19% alone in the non-student visa and visitor visa category. That in itself drove the decline in student numbers. But when we had the increase in student visas itself, numbers went down, but the student weeks actually still had growth on prior year. And it comes back to that impact on what Patrick displayed earlier around the average student length of the student visa holders and the demography of those students, particularly those Latin American students staying longer. But the order in terms of the economic order, student weeks stayed consistent with the prior year. We'll go into the proportions, and this is where I was just noting we can still see that it's not to be dismissed, the non-student category. It's over 20% in every one of our student markets. That's the richness of the data that we get through this survey process, and the way in which we have looked at those visas, non-student, of which we do categorise various terms of other, but predominantly in the tourist and working holiday visa type. That's in the report too, so we'll skip through to more of the unique analysis. Go over this relatively quick, sort of just looking at it on a year-by-year change. New South Wales still is the highest in terms of its market share as a state. We see that it dominates in terms of the total student numbers, leading towards economic impact almost of $1 billion, just over 900,000 in terms of the economic impact to the state itself. However, again, mostly impacted by the decline in China for New South Wales. But we'll go through to try to get to some of the provider type stuff relatively quick, because we've put a little bit more analysis into the provider type, which isn't necessarily in the report itself. Queensland, again, we've slightly higher market share, decline in student numbers. As I pointed out, it was pretty much driven by the decline in the non-student visa holder, whereas in the total number of weeks and therefore economic impact, it still had a positive result for the prior year. Overall, just a changing profile of the student mix in Queensland. And actually, so if I'll just go back one slide, because it'll just give you a quick picture around what happened in those top source markets. And interestingly, I think when you look at Queensland, even though we've still got the primary market in Queensland isn't China, it still is Japan in terms of total numbers. Historically, we've had Japan and WA as the two key markets that Japan was #1 over and above China. But interestingly enough, the weeks that came through, particularly with Colombia and Brazil, and that the impact on student teaching that we had out of those two markets, really positive in Queensland from both of those markets. Even though Brazil had a decline, it's still, overall nationally, it still grew for Queensland. So fast forward, SA. SA was another one. In terms of SA, we saw two markets go down, Saudi Arabia and China. SA is really dominated by China as its primary market. So the declining numbers out of China and the declining weeks out of Saudi Arabia had the biggest impact. So even though, in fact, overall, South Australia was the winning state in the last year in terms of growth on a national scale, we had that impact of those students, particularly have a look at the next slide, so and particularly as we look at the students from China, the increase wasn't significant in terms of the numbers, the relationship between the numbers and weeks was far more significant in China, and then later down has said a really significant, about 80% decline in weeks out of Saudi Arabia, which was traditionally another strong market for South Australia as well. So skipping forward, Victoria, as we saw, #2 state overall. It actually performed somewhat better than the national average, and we saw that across, particularly around the student cohort, student visa cohort. Here again, and probably the trend that we've observed throughout the presentation, that decline out of the non-student visa holder was the most of the impact that we had in Victoria over the past year. The trend was a little bit different in particularly weeks, but I think again the big winner throughout this presentation has been Colombia, overtaking Brazil in the last year in terms of from 3 to number 2 nationally, but the contributions to weeks is really significant. And as we start to think about where we invest moving forward and where we put our time and energy, these key markets, I don't think we can lose the platform that's been developed over many years, particularly with the work that's been done in Latin America and the high yield. Now, we note the sectors, and we'll have a look at the sector data in terms of provider type, but in terms of the teaching aspect of those markets, it's a really strong outcome. From WA, we again had the similar trend running through, non-student weeks going down, non-student visas declining more than the student visa cohort, overall performing a little bit better than national average. And we saw actually growth in this market. We'll jump onto the next one, from what was probably a bit more of a lower base traditionally, but the Colombians came into the market, Brazilians came into the market. As I said, it's working on a different scale to the other sort of eastern states, but the real impact on WA was mainly out of China and secondary from Japan in that mix of student cohorts. And as I noted, we've sort of had a shift, which the Japanese student cohort was traditionally the number 1 for WA as well. Moving forward, we'll try and get to the provider type. Okay, so provider type, Patrick, do you want to jump in and do a bit of provider type data?
Absolutely. A bit of a context perhaps before I really dive deep into the data, which is that Australia currently offers probably the most granular level of analysis in this regard. So it's a very diverse industry, and it's probably the only one that measures 6 standalone provider categories. So if you look at other destinations, the distinction is perhaps private and state sector, but that's it. In Australia, given the diverse student population, it was decided 3 years ago that there's going to be a far deeper analysis provided, which sort of recognizes individual providers' needs. As you can see on the slide, there are 6 different categories that we measure, and thanks to a really robust sample over the last 3 years specifically, we are able to provide trend data on how individual provider types perform, and not just in terms of national performance, but also broken down by individual states. In terms of market shares for the 6 main categories, we could see that standalone ELICOS colleges actually improved over the year and currently account for more than 42% of all students in Australia. The second largest cohort of students studied at vet colleges in 2019. The university segment remains another strong band of providers, accounting for 21% of students. Multi-sector school and private higher education cumulatively account for 11%. There is a slight change when looking at student weeks. Obviously, the vet sector, which is the primary destination of major nationalities such as Colombia, account for more market share in terms of weeks. So it's 30.1 in terms of weeks. Standalone colleges, a slight decline if we correlate with student numbers, equaling to 38 percentage points. University 17, private higher education, slightly bigger market share in weeks than in numbers, and the opposite trend we saw for the multi-sector providers. Moving on, this is the demonstration of market shares in individual states. So as I said, we do not stop with the national benchmark. You can see that standalone colleges are the biggest recipient of ELICOS students in New South Wales, accounting for 37%. It's slightly lower than the national average of 42%. There is a strong university-based ELICOS population as well, more than the average, 28% of students studying at uni-affiliated colleges, and vet sector reasonably strong as well, accounting for 1/4 of students. On the right, you can see how it translates into student weeks, where the vet sector gains considerably more market share at the expense of both standalone colleges and university-affiliated colleges. And if you can move. Yep, this is basically what the top 5 market performance looks like for individual states. This is already provided in the report as well, where you can find the full ranking of source countries measured. You can see the year-on-year development, both in student numbers and student weeks. We can probably skip that at this point, as I'd like to focus on the next analysis, which is the ranking of source countries by both region, Australian state, or even country level. You can see how this differs based on different providers. If you look at university-based colleges, for instance, you can see that the top 3 nationalities account for 73% of the market. So the market is rather concentrated compared to standalone and vet-based colleges. There's also difference in terms of top nationalities. So while Brazil accounts for the majority of students for both standalone and vet-based colleges at 13 and 16% respectively, China really dominates the university-based segment, with more than half of enrollments being from China. We believe that this is an important part of decision making and when to allocate marketing dollars, also going forward, as perhaps 19 will be the benchmark year for any future activities. This is not part of the report, but I was informed that the presentation will be made available to all participating colleges. And again, this will allow you to benchmark your institution at a very, very granular level, with the biggest benefit obviously being the understanding where your college might be missing the train, where you can improve your market share, but also vice versa, where your college is actually reaching a significant market share and further increases might not be expected. I believe we can move to the next slide, which is the analysis for Queensland, where you can see that standalone colleges are really the predominant recipient of ELICOS students, both in numbers and weeks. There's also a strong vet sector. University-based colleges do not enjoy that significant share, and is also connected to the student profile, obviously coming to Queensland, which is not that related to, for instance, higher education and pathway programs. Looking at the top source countries for the region, similar analysis can be drawn. You can see that top 3 countries account for more market share, so it's less diverse when compared to New South Wales, for instance. You can see that each of the sectors featured enjoy a different top source market. It's Japan for standalone colleges, while for university-based it remains China, and Colombians, as Brad was talking about, really fueled further increases in the vet-based sector in Queensland. We can move to the next. In the region of South Australia, the university, and again, bearing in mind this is a smaller sector, a smaller state in terms of numbers and weeks, nonetheless, university-based colleges enjoy a 1/3 market share and are followed by a multi-sector, which is of biggest importance of all the states. Nonetheless, the biggest recipient of students are standalone colleges, accounting for 42% of all students, so pretty much in line with the national average, and 34% in terms of student weeks. In terms of nationalities, again, the situation is a bit different. As was mentioned, the state is largely dependent on students from China, so any significant drop from these particular source markets are gonna impact the state as such. We see China being the biggest market for standalone multi-sector as well as university-based colleges. Interestingly enough, for web-based colleges, South Korea represents 17% of all enrollments, followed by India and China, both at 13% point. So we don't see that much of an impact of Colombian students in the state of South Australia. Looking at the remaining of Australian states, the situation in Victoria is relatively balanced. Looking at different provider types, the biggest number of students are studying at standalone colleges, although it's significantly lower than the national benchmark, 33.6%, followed by vet colleges. University-based account for 23% of all students. In terms of weeks, we see quite a high market share of multi-sector colleges again, but the biggest chunk of student weeks are generated at vet colleges, 42.6%. In terms of nationalities, again, based on the availability of different provider type data, we're able to see that China really dominates the multi-sector segment in Victoria. University-based colleges also enjoy quite a high proportion of Chinese students, followed by Japanese. And web-based, this is where we can see the impact of Colombia being the top source country for this particular provider type in Victoria. Moving on to the final region, which is Western Australia. Almost half of students study at standalone colleges. This also translates into the big market share in terms of student weeks, so 56% of all student weeks spent at standalone colleges, followed by university-based centers and vet segment. And in terms of nationalities, again, granular level, we can see that it's less diverse. So top markets do not represent the majority of student enrollments, which is perhaps the only exception to that, university-based colleges, where China again accounts for the majority of students. We also see Brazil maintaining a really solid position for the standalone segment of colleges, and China and Colombia being the top two markets for the web-based colleges. So again, this will allow you to better benchmark your institution and to understand your individual position in these source countries. We can probably move to the next slide.
Thanks, Patrick. And colleagues, I know we're heading towards pretty much on the time that we've allocated for the session today. But just before we do, and so if you would just scroll forward just for me for one moment. I wanted to just quickly again acknowledge the support from our partner Allianz Global Assistance. Talking to the team at the moment, so if we just move into the next slide as well, we've, they are fully committed to supporting the students. As everyone's been at home during this period, it's been similar for those students onshore, international students. Allianz are fully equipped in terms of their telehealth solution, their digital solution, and have been had increased calls as you'd expect from students wanting to know, what cover they have or any health issues, and being able to have telehealth support and instant claim support. So just a very quick acknowledgement for the great work that they do and support that they've provided for today's presentation. A local list of contacts is up on the screen. I encourage you, if you have any questions in terms of your overseas health care provider or wanted to know any information, please contact the local reps. Again, thank you to all of the colleges that participated in this annual survey. Equally, thank you very much to the Department of Education, Skills and Employment, and our partner Bonard, and again Patrick for picking up today when there were a few technical issues earlier on. Colleagues, if there was anything that's been missed today, we're very happy to follow up any questions that you may have. As noted, we will distribute a copy of the presentation as well as the report, aiming to have that to you all tomorrow. Once again, a sincere thank you. We'll be back in a couple of weeks' time to present again on the new initiative this year, the Quarterly Market ELICOS Insights Initiative. So that'll have the first data set from January to March this year. Wonderful participation. We've had over 100 colleges nationally participate, which is a great result, and we'll be able to give you the most up-to-date information in a similar context for what the trends are occurring in 2020. So with the interest of time, I'm going to again acknowledge and thank my colleague presenter, Patrick, and to all of the members and participants that contributed to the survey. Thank you, and appreciate all the support. Bye for now.
Thank you for having me. Bye, everyone.